אז לכבוד פרופסור הקמן, אני אדבר באנגלית, אבל זה יהיה קצר בכל מקרה החלק שלי. It's an honor and a privilege and a real pleasure to be able to introduce the speakers who are going to speak now. Given that for me this is something I'm really looking forward to listening to, as well as all the other speeches we've had today, but a special honor and a special pleasure because Professor Heckman was one of my teachers in the University of Chicago, and a lot of what I know about econometrics and about labor, and probably more that I don't know, is is thanks to Professor Heckman. So I see it as my job mainly to get out of the way as quickly as possible so that you can hear from who you want to hear. So I'm really just going to introduce Professor Heckman. And then I'm also going to introduce another speaker who's going to actually speak before Professor Heckman and maybe give a more serious and more general type of introduction than I'll give, which is Professor Manuel Trachtenberg. Professor Heckman is a professor of economics, director of the Center of the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. Professor Heckman is also the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and Public Policy and Director of the Center for the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. He has devoted his professional life to understanding the origins of major social and economic questions related to inequality, social mobility, discrimination, and the formation of skills and regulation in labor markets, as well as to devising and applying economically interpretable empirical strategies for understanding and addressing these questions. Professor Heckman has published over 300 articles and 9 books on these topics. He is recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, the John Bates Clark Medal, the Jacob Mincer Award, the Dennis Eigner Award, the Ulysses Medal, the Theodore W. Schultz Award, the Gold Medal of the President of the Italian Republic, the Frisch Medal, the Dan David Prize, and is Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association. Of course, you all know that the main topic of today's talk, is going to be early ages, and in particular, we're all well familiar with the famous Heckman equation, which I do not see here anymore. I put up here and don't see it here now. Did we disappear? Okay, it doesn't matter.
We'll pull it out.
Okay. So you can read all your mail now.
For everyone to see.
So this is the very famous Heckman equation. I think probably all of you have seen it, or many of you have seen it certainly. If you invest in early education for disadvantaged children, and you develop cognitive skills, social abilities, and healthy behaviors early, and you sustain early development with effective education through to adulthood, what you gain is a more capable and productive workforce. That's what called the Heckman equation. That's what it's been dubbed, and properly so. It's also my pleasure to introduce my very good friend, Professor Manuel Trachtenberg. You all know him. He's a former member of Knesset, very former, and an Israeli economist. Professor Trachtenberg was born in Argentina, immigrated to Israel when he was 16. He has a BA and an MA in economics from the Hebrew University, PhD from Harvard University. Following his studies, he returned to Israel and taught at Tel Aviv University, where he later served as the head of the School of Economics. Professor Trachtenberg has published numerous research studies and has gained international acclaim of one of the world's leading experts in R&D, patents, and economic growth. In 2006, Professor Trachtenberg established and chaired the Israeli National Economic Council in the Prime Minister's office, where he formulated the socio-economic agenda for the country, promoted the adoption of a negative income tax, and was a member of the Rodet Committee to examine defense spending. In September 2009, he was appointed chair of the Council of Higher Education Budget and Planning Committee. He led a multi-year plan to rehabilitate Israel's higher education system, established centers of excellence to incentivize the return of young scholars from abroad, and promote accessibility of higher education for Haredim and Arabs in Israel. Following 2011 social protests in Israel, Professor Trachtenberg was appointed by the Prime Minister to head, the Trachtenberg Committee, which is obvious since it was called the Trachtenberg Committee, the Committee for the Socioeconomic Change, which published a comprehensive report that led, among other things, to public funding for preschool children for ages 3 to 4. In December of 2014, he resigned as chair of the Budget and Planning Committee to join the political arena and was elected to Knesset as part of the Zionist Union. During his time as a member of Knesset, Professor Trachtenberg served on the Finance, the Education, and Defense Budget Committees. He also established the Lobby for Equal Opportunity for the Haredi community, served as co-chair of the Lobby for the Protection of Preschoolers in Israel, and drafted and gained approval for the law establishing the National Commission for Early Age Education. Manuel, please.
שלום לכולכם, אני מאוד שמח להשתתף בכנס החשוב והמעניין הזה. אני תרשו לי לפתוח כמה מילים באנגלית, כדי שגם ג'ים, פרופסור הקמן, ישמע. Typically, Avi, when you introduce somebody that got the Nobel Prize in Economics, you can save yourself the long list of awards and other titles, because that sums it up all, right? But in the case of Professor Heckman, I think that saying just that he got the Nobel Prize in Economics is not doing justice to neither to the person nor to what he has done. And that is because, he got the Nobel Prize together with Daniel McFadden in 2000, the year 2000. A good year to get the Nobel Prize. It's easy to remember. But actually, he got the Nobel Prize primarily for his contributions to econometrics, of which any economist here, all of us, were raised with it, the Heckman correction and so forth. I remember studying it for the first time, and it was amazingly kind of simple in a way and obvious. And I say, hey, how we didn't know that before, because it's so clear that we had to do that. But he had a tremendous impact on methodology, on the econometrics, on all of us. And that was essentially the main mention, not the only one, but the main, in the Nobel Prize award. Since 2000, he embarked in a second intellectual adventure, and not just intellectual, which is essentially putting on the table early childhood education as the main thing we can do, the main investment we can do in order to try to diminish inequality and open up equal opportunities for all. I don't know, truly, of any other prominent economist, of any other Nobel Prize laureate that made such a tremendous switch in his career, although he keeps publishing, also in econometrics and so forth. But that's not the point in terms of where he is at. And he has become a household name all over the world to all those that deal with early childhood. And I know that for a fact, because I've been very active in this field lately, not among economists. And Heckman, yes, he's like in Hebrew we would say the Admor of the early childhood education. Admor is a word you should learn, Jim. It means Adoneinu Moreru Rabbeinu. It's something which is awarded to the big rabbis. You don't need to grow a beard for that. Although you know of a friend of us that. Anyway, so when he will be speaking to you here, remember that fact. Remember the fact that here you have a Nobel Prize winning laureate that has turned his attention and his intellectual prowess to address a tremendously important issue for society, and that's not something that we usually find among academic economists. So that's to begin with, and now I'll switch to Hebrew, with your permission. בהינתן שיש לי רק כמה דקות, אני רוצה להגיד את הדברים בצורה מאוד טלגרפית. תראו, כיום יש עדנה לתחום של הגיל הרך, אצלנו ובחלקים גדולים של העולם. אבל בואו לא נתבלבל. יש עדנה, אבל אנחנו מאוד רחוקים מלהגיע ליעד. מכיוון שכיום רוב האלה שיש להם נגיעה לתחום הזה, אכן משלמים מס שפתיים במקרה הטוב, אבל כן, זה נורא חשוב, זה השלב הכי חשוב בחיים, אנחנו מבינים שהמחקר המדעי מראה שההתפתחות של המוח כן, בשנתיים הראשונות היא קריטית וכולי, אבל עדיין בתקציבים של המדינה לשלבים השונים של החינוך, הגיל הרך הוא עדיין במקום האחרון, ובפרט בשנתיים הראשונות לחיים. ובהקשרים מסוימים בשנה הראשונה כמעט שאין כלום, חוץ מטיפת חלב ועוד כמה דברים שהם מינוריים לחלוטין. כלומר, אין שום הלימה בין מס השפתיים, בין האמירות, בין הלכאורה ההכרה בחשיבות, לבין מה שקורה בפועל. אין הלימה. ולכן המאבק הוא רק בתחילתו. ואני מדבר במונחים של מאבק, כי אין פה עניין של שכנוע אינטלקטואלי. יש עניין כאן של כל יום ביומו, כל שבוע, כל חודש, כל שנה. אנחנו צריכים להיות שם כדי שהעניין הזה לא ירד מסדר היום, ותהיה איזושהי תזוזה הדרגתית, והיא תהיה, היא כבר קורית, אבל איטית מדי לטעמי, כדי שהגיל הרך יקבל תשומת הלב ואת המשאבים הדרושים. כשאני אומר איטית מדי, אני רוצה שנבין את המשמעות. מה שאתה לא עושה כיום, היום, בשעה הזאת, עם הילדים בני שנה ושנתיים ושלוש, נגמר הסיפור. כלומר, לא תוכל לתקן אחר כך, ואתה דן במדינת ישראל כ-160,000 ילדים פר שנה שנולדים כאן, לאי שוויון מאוד מאוד גדול אחר כך, אתה דן חלק ניכר מהם לאי מיצוי של הפוטנציאל שלהם, ואפילו לזנב שלהם להיות נטל על החברה. זה מה שאתה עושה כיום. ואין לזה תקנה, שנבין את זה, אין לזה תקנה. אז לכן אני אומר שיש פה איזושהי דחיפות ואיזושהי עבודה שצריך לעשות, והיא מוטלת על כולנו. מוטלת על מרכזי מחקר, ומוטלת על פוליטיקאים, ומוטלת על הפרקטישנרס, מה שנקרא, אלה שעוסקים בזה בשטח וכו'. לצד זה יש התפתחויות חיוביות. אני חייב להודות, ואני יכול להגיד את זה בפה מלא, אני הרגשתי שאני יכולתי לקום ולעזוב את הכנסת, רק כאשר החוק להקמת המועצה לגיל הרך עבר, והחוק הזה עבר ביום האחרון של המושב האחרון של הכנסת. ואז הרגשתי שאני יכול לקום וללכת. ולחוק הזה יש, להבדיל מכל חוק אחר, יש שעון מתקתק. נכתב החוק, ברגע האחרון הכנסנו את זה, שהמועצה חייבת לקום עד 1 לפברואר 2018. אז היא תקום. זה שלב ראשון. זה עדיין צריך לתת לזה צורה ותכנים ותקציבים וכו', אבל זה כיוון אחד. כיוון שני, עוד פעם אני אומר את זה רק טלגרפית, אני עסוק בצורה מאוד אינטנסיבית, ואני אמשיך בזה, בהקמת קמפוסים לגיל הרך. קמפוסים, לאמור one stop shop, מקום אחד, מבנה רב תכליתי ורב קומתי, שבו יהיה מענה לכל הגילאים, מגיל חצי שנה נגיד ועד גיל 6, כל השלבים, כל הפונקציות, כולל חינוך, התפתחות, בריאות, כולל הכשרה של הצוותים המקצועיים, שלוחות של המכללות לא רע בתוך הדבר הזה. יש 4 שהם בשלבים שונים של הקמה, אחד בקריית ביאליק, אחד באשדוד, ו2 בבאר שבע. ויש תמיכה מסוימת קטנה מדי מהפילנתרופיה, ויש תמיכה חזקה מאוד מהדרג המקצועי ומהרשות המקומית, מהרשויות המקומיות. כי בעיניי צריך לפעול בצורה מקבילה בשני הרבדים האלה, ברובד הלאומי וברובד המקומי, מכיוון שאנחנו בתהליך של בניית קונצפט. זה לא עניין של לשכפל מודלים קיימים ולשפוך יותר כסף במודל הקודם, אלא בניית מציאות חדשה. אין שום הלימה בין מדינה שבה יש לה שיעור הריבוי הטבעי, הילודה, מה שנקרא fertility rate, שיעור הפריון הכי גבוה ב-OECD בגדול, 3.1 ילדים לאישה בגילים הרלוונטיים מול 1.7 ממוצע של OECD, ושיעור השתתפות בתעסוקה מהגבוהים ב-OECD של נשים, כן, של נשים, ויחד עם זאת המדינה אומרת, טוב, תסתדרו, תביאו הרבה ילדים, תצאו לעבוד, הכל טוב ויפה, כן, אחר כך, כן, הילדים, נשים אותם באיזשהו מקום כזה, מעון, דייקר, זה שאתה יודע, שמישהו יטפל בהם. אין דבר כזה. מדינת ישראל היא מדינה, במובן הזה יוצאת דופן לטובה ולרעה. ולרעה, מכיוון שבהינתן הנתונים על ילודה ועל השתתפות בכוח אדם, בתעסוקה, הזוגות הצעירים במדינת ישראל נאבקים תחת עול בלתי סביר, שלא לדבר על עניין של הדיור, שזה גם תופעה שזכינו בה, כן? כמו ההיפר-אינפלציה בשנות ה-80 המוקדמות, בערך אותה תופעה של חוסר אחריות משוועת של המדינה. ולכן אנחנו מחויבים לעשות בשני המישורים האלה, להביא לא רק פתרון, להביא בשורה, בשורה ברמה העולמית. אני אומר את זה באחריות, ופרופסור הקמן, אני מניח, יתייחס למה שקורה בארצות הברית וגם במדינות אחרות. אז רבותיי, למלאכה יש לנו הרבה מה לעשות. תודה.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I take it as a responsibility to try to live up to this very glorious description, which I appreciate. What I want to talk about today is my talk will be in several parts. The first is I want to review some familiar facts that are relevant, I think, for the discussion about social mobility generally, not just early childhood, but early childhood will play a prominent role. But then I also want to talk about the dynamics of skill formation and what we've learned about it. It's a very exciting subject for me. I think, Manuel, you were saying I had started working on this. I think my whole life I've been interested in how human capital gets accumulated. I was attracted to the work of Gary Becker when I was a graduate student. And so this is in some sense a continuation of a body of work. But to link up with what Dalton was saying earlier today, partly some of the later inspiration for working on this came from exactly the same source, the bell curve. I mean, if you ever read the book, you'll see that I'm the first person thanked among the acknowledgments, because the author of that book, at least Charles Murray, came to Chicago frequently when he was writing the book. And we talked until he got to the last sections, and he no longer talks to me. But it was very interesting. I found the book very, very fascinating. And that what I found fascinating, because he was, I think, the very first person, at least in my knowledge, to take this measure of IQ, or what you called IQ. I wouldn't call it that, but a measure of cognition, and link it up to prediction in the labor market and to a bunch of social outcomes. I thought that was interesting. And of course, he went on to develop, and he and Herrnstein, but Herrnstein died in the process, so Murray took over. He went on to discuss to talk about what is essentially a genetic argument, to essentially say we have this IQ, this measure of IQ is very predictive. That was one claim. I don't think it really is, but that was one claim. And secondly, we can't do much about it. So the mentally feeble should be put on reservations. That was really his notion. And I thought that was very dramatic. And frankly, I found it very pessimistic. But at the same time, and linking to another session, I have been doing a lot of work on job training in the U.S. There was randomized trials and so forth. And the lessons that I was getting from this, other studies and other scholars were working on this, were finding very low economic returns to job training for teenagers and young adults. For women, there was some effect. For young men, almost none. And certainly for the adolescent, males or females, there was no. So I developed this sense of pessimism. And then what happened is that I went to a conference, just by accident, heard a neuroscientist, a guy named Harry Shigani, who's at Wayne State University, talk about just showing some basic data about the effects of early life experiences on the brain. He showed the Romanian infants. Many of you have heard about these very dramatic instances where children have been denied any kind of access. And I found this stimulating, and it was kind of like a lifeline for me. I said, well, if we can't we can't do it with job training, maybe we can do it with something else. So I started looking at it, and ironically, Herrnstein himself had done an evaluation of a study in Venezuela where he had found an early childhood program was boosting IQ and was promoting development. So I got into this, kind of backed into it from pessimism, but also some interest in the bell curve, and that'll show up. So in this sense, what I'm talking about today is going to be kind of first of all, an overview of some of what I've done before, and then trying to talk about the whole issue of social mobility and how early childhood figures into this. So I just want to talk about two graphs, one of which has already been put up by the first speaker in this conference. So I don't have to sort of go through this graph. But there are two graphs that I would say that are dominating current discussions about social mobility around the world. The first you've seen already. This is called the Great Gatsby Curve. It was coined by Alan Kruger. It was actually the measure, Miles Korak actually drew this curve. And it's a relationship between what's called the IGE, the relationship, the coefficient on some long-run measure of the income of the child on some long-run measure of the income of the parent. And so the higher beta in this relationship, the more immobility there is, the more family or accident of birth plays a role. And you can see this empirical relationship, which is basically saying that the more inequality, it looks like the greater the measure of beta. And that's one graph that's dominated the world. Now, there are multiple interpretations of this, and I want to talk about that today and how we might respond to it. I did try to break out. Here, I should really rely on the Israelis. I tried on best. I have an Israeli research assistant who took this and supplemented the Korak graph by putting in various groups in Israel. I'm not sure this is accurate. I would be more than happy to be corrected on this. So nonetheless, it suggests, compared to the U.S., the intergenerational mobility is actually higher in Israel than it would be, for example, in Italy, UK, and the U.S. So that's one graph. How you interpret it, not clear. Secondly, and this is something more recent that's come along, which is the power of place. So Chetty in particular, but a group of people, Sampson, a sociologist at Harvard, and many others have been talking about the power of place. And this is, again, like the first graph, an empirical correlation. And here the point is that people born in certain environments are more or less likely to be upwardly mobile. And so this graph by Chetty shows, for example, Salt Lake City shows a lot more mobility. It's the probability of reaching the top fifth of the income distribution if you start in the bottom fifth. And what you're finding is very bad mobility rates in very poor areas, especially in the southern part of the United States. But if you go to Salt Lake City or San Jose, which is basically Silicon Valley, you're getting a lot of upward mobility. So that's another graph. People talking about the power of place. But the real question for today and for the whole conference, I think, is how to interpret these relationships and what policy should be promoted. What do we make of these graphs? And I think that's the real question analytically, to try to see what would be good policies. And I want to talk about policies, but I also want to try to understand what the basic, how do we can understand these graphs and how we can understand the importance of family in creating opportunity. So going back to the Gatsby curve, there's a notion, the first dot here is the notion that inequality itself leads to more immobility. And the idea is very simple. You know, you have poorer parents, they can't transfer their resources, they can't invest as much in the children, and that would actually lead to immobility. So credit constraints, kind of typical argument that many economists make. Many people interpret it. In fact, earlier today, I think that was the interpretation given. But there's another interpretation. And the other interpretation is that social immobility itself can create inequality because the generations are linked. The parents pass along not just their genes, but also the family influence. And so that's an open question as to how we interpret these empirical relationships and how policy should react. So I think to understand these relationships, we have to understand the sources of inequality in society and how to devise effective policies. That's really what I want to talk about. And so looking at these graphs, and we've talked about all these things today, and we'll probably talk more in the concluding session, what are the mechanisms that are producing this immobility? What's producing inequality? So we can think of the family. The family is kind of a central aspect of modern, of society. And it's been that way since we were probably just walking on all fours. I mean, the family has played a very, very powerful role. But now we think in a more contemporary discussion, what is the role of schools, neighborhoods playing a big role in that second graph about neighborhood effects, or the Chetty graphs, peers. What's the role of tax and transfer policy? And what's macro policy? So I can't answer all of these, but I will give a sketch of what I think the evidence is. And there are also some issues, which I'm not going to talk much about what's the proper measure of mobility. I mean, we can, in the Chetty graph, this graph of geographical immobility, one notion is looking at rank or positional mobility. Another is whether or not there's absolute mobility. Are the children doing better than the parents? And what about mobility within a lifetime? How much within a given course, not just across generations, but in your own life? A person starting poor can basically undo it. But there is some evidence, and I'll just skip over it because we've talked about it earlier today and it's been much in the news, that at least in the United States, and I think also in the United Kingdom, I don't know in Israel, that recent cohorts appear to be doing worse than the previous, than their parents, just at an absolute level. So this is a graph, again, recently popularized by Chetty, showing the percent of children earning more than their parents by the parental income decile. So this is going across cohorts. And so in the 1940s, it was relatively easy to do better than your parents. These were Depression-era parents. If you get to the 1980s, it's obviously not so good, and we're finding, at least in the U.S., a lot of children are not leaving home until they're in the 30s. They really are having trouble. It's not just student debt, it's also the job market and kind of the prospects facing them. So there really is a question. There's some other measures that you can take, and it's not just this one study. This is work by Herrnstein and Mazumdar, and more recent study by Guvenen and others looking at finding with Social Security data, different kinds of data, that basically recent cohorts seem to be doing worse. And the rise in inequality seems to be concentrated among the younger cohorts. I won't go over all these graphs. I don't have time, but this is a very nice graph that came from the work of Guvenen and his co-authors. Again, corroborating the idea that the cohorts, the youngest cohorts, are really kind of generating a lot of the growth and inequality in the U.S. So what we find is this phenomenon. So the early cohorts and the recent cohorts seem to be the ones that are actually being hit very hard. And this is a statistic that's staggering for people who aren't familiar with the U.S., but it turns out that if we look at one measure of disadvantage among American youth, that about 71% of all American youth in the draft eligible age or the military service eligible age are not qualified to serve. And the reasons vary. Now, one is college enrollment. That's not such a bad reason, but that's not the major source. A lot of it's obesity, a lot of it's bad health, a lot of it turns out that low mental ability is measured by the AFQT. And so there really is a sense that, that in the United States, and most of my talk will be from data from the United States. I will talk from some data from other countries. In Israel, when I can could find some data, that we're finding that there are serious issues. And in fact, this affects the workforce in the United States. You find many, many employers in booming economies saying that they cannot get even trained high school graduates who will show up and even show up on time and basically be able to stay and hold a steady job. So anyway, you can go over all the details. So what is the source of immobility? So we see this problem. It's affecting the current generation. But what explains, going back to the Gatsby curve, what are the sources of inequality? And I want to talk about these sources. So first of all, taxes and transfers play a powerful role in the Gatsby curve. And I want to come back to that now and then at the end, because I want to talk about some studies across countries. So of course, if we look at the Gatsby curve, I didn't tell you what the measure of income was, income mobility. It's a measure of household income across generations, and it's after taxes and transfers. So part of that mobility that you see in countries like Denmark and in Sweden, and actually I'm going to argue that most of the mobility in places like Denmark and Sweden and Norway as a result of taxes and transfers. It's not fundamentally differences in investment strategies. And that's an important role. So I realize I'll run out of time, but I want to get this message across. Because what happens, at least in the US context, there's been a lot of discussion. The 2016 campaign, Bernie Sanders in particular, who was running for the Democratic nomination, was glorifying Denmark as kind of an ideal, a social welfare ideal. And in many ways it is. And it's a nice laboratory to study. Because Denmark is a place where there's been a lot of equalization. If you look at the amount of money spent per capita on each child, you look at the incidence of preschool, you'll find that 90 to 95% of the children in Denmark are getting some form of high-quality preschool. So by much of the modern standards, you're getting a very, very important, trend. But what I want to argue is that despite all that, there are substantial differences by family background in terms of achievement over the whole life cycle. I'll show you some graphs. So something deeper than just the current policies that receive so much attention is at work in Denmark. And it's an open debate. In fact, I'm now a very inflammatory character in Denmark. It's a small country, so nobody notices that. But there really is, it has created a whole stir because they think of themselves as being the poster child for modern progressive policies, and they are. But the question is they haven't really tackled a fundamental source of inequality. This is a graph we saw earlier. This is taxes and transfers. I single out Israel. We can see before taxes and transfers, inequality varies, okay, but this is household income adjusted for per capita expenditure and so forth. But what you find, for example, in Israel, the difference between the light bar and the dark bar is the difference between pre-tax transfer inequality and post-tax household income. So taxes and transfers play a big role. You can see if you look left side of this graph from your face, you're looking at Iceland and places like Denmark. There's a huge redistributional aspect. So and if we look at the growth of inequality across the OECD, just generally, what we find when we do simple accounting is that one major source of inequality, now this is just cross-section inequality, is skills. Skills, like men's earnings disparity, accounts about 42% of the growth. This is taken from an OECD study of 3 or 4 years ago now. So, and these other points, assortative mating we heard about, it plays a relatively small role. More educated men are marrying more educated women. There are a lot of single-parent households. Household structure then accounts for about 11% of the growth. The residual, unfortunately, is very big, and female employment is actually an equalizing force. So these are factors that are, I emphasize this only to point out that skills are still an important determinant of inequality. And in fact, any policy that tackles inequality and social mobility has to talk about skills. There in the U.S., there's more finer decompositions. And what you'll see is that men's earnings disparity, which includes both labor supply and prices paid per unit labor, it's a major component in the growth of the Gini coefficient, income inequality. Assortative mating, women's employment, again, is an equalizing force. Women's earnings disparity is a disequalizing force, though. So these factors hold up. So skills are important. So that's really going to be the premise of what I'm saying. So effective policies are going to be policies that essentially promote skills. But we have to understand what skills are. And here I would make some qualification of what I heard earlier today about skills, even from you, Dalton. So I'll get your engagement here. But fostering skills to promote social mobility. So what are we going to do? So I want to talk about a comprehensive approaches. And I would argue, and this is really all I have to say, that plus the common sense thing that mothers matter, families matter. I think that's so obvious that you don't need me to say that. But somehow in social policy, the obvious is neglected. I mean, that's an interesting finding. I think it's really almost a defect of education. It's a defect of the academic system. We become specialized, and these topics become so kind of taken off that we can't really appeal to common sense. But I'm going to give you evidence that common sense actually prevails in this case here, and give you, I think, what's hard evidence. Skill is important. That's a major ingredient of inequality. Whether we're talking about health inequality, whether we're talking about inequality in mental health, whether we're talking about earnings inequality, whether we're talking about inequality in crime. Skills are an important determinant. But a second point that is really important, and something I learned in this process, is that we have to think about a variety of skills. It's the multiplicity of skills. So much emphasis, even today's conference, people talked about PISA scores. PISA scores are only a tiny part of the success story. And in fact, this is even the OECD, which actually fostered PISA, is now going around collecting other and encouraging countries to collect richer measures of skill. And to understand and evaluate successful interventions, you need to actually have the right measures of skill. And one of the wrong measures of skill is IQ. People use that all the time. I'll show you how bad it is. So so I will argue that you want to think much more broadly about what skills are. But a lot of recent work has made what used to be called soft skills. People thought, what does it matter? How can you measure who's conscientious, or who's showing up on time, or who's altruistic, or somehow compassionate? How can you measure that? Well, we do have measures. And we actually now, I think, have hard measures. And it's a whole subject all by itself, and it's quite an exciting subject. It's a subject under evolution. But nonetheless, I think we do have hard evidence. And OECD itself is looking at this and encouraging it. So, and we have to also understand, as we've said earlier today, schools, families, neighborhoods, firms, they're all producing skills. So one of the fallacies in a lot of the literature is to think skills and schools are the same. Schools are the major producer of skills. They're not. And in fact, I would argue schools are only a small part, and maybe in modern society, much less. Even the production of skills in schools depends on family support of children in the schools, which is something that doesn't get taken into account. So I think we have to really understand the importance of supporting and incentivizing all of these sources of skill. And so I will try to show some recent evaluations of what I would argue are effective ways to go about this. So I think a skill-based policy is essentially an effective policy. And what I would argue is that you want to think about policies that are trying to tackle problems that have a core set of solutions. In other words, a lot of current policy discussions will think about realizing and targeting a problem only after it arises. I would argue that in the case of some policies, in a sense of developing skills, we have enough evidence to argue prevention may be better than remediation after the occurrence of the policy. And in fact, in the early childhood analysis, it is. So the fragmented quality, I mean, this is the kind of, I don't know what the Hebrew version of this is, I'm sure there is one, that usually the notion is you solve problems as they arise. That's efficient in some sense. Why should you start, providing, solving problems that may never arise? And so there really is a question of why should we start early? Why not just wait for people to commit crimes and then we prevent that by hiring more police, or wait, people get sick and then we get doctors to treat them. That's not a bad idea, but it's also not necessarily the most efficient social policy. So the question is prevention efficient? And here, what I want to argue, and this is something that I think is really important, there's some recent work in a new paper published by Gatsby and Moffat in a British journal, Nature Human Behavior, just started publication this January. They actually follow this cohort of people in New Zealand, the so-called Dunedin cohort. And what they find, and these are people, they followed them from birth, they followed, no experiment, but they follow people over their lifetimes from the time they're born, at least up until the late 30s. And so they can chart who's causing which problem. They wrote a paper, and the paper has something, it has Pareto in the title, because the argument is Pareto principle, that 20% of all of the actors, no matter what the actors are, but they're talking about social problems, account for 80% of the results. But they find that that's not far off the mark in terms of New Zealand. So for example, if you look at social welfare benefits, 20% of the cohort members are accounting for 80% of the social welfare benefits. There are a lot of other things, crime, health, a number of other issues, 20%. And they're concentrated in the same small group of people. That's a major finding. And so here's the whole set of findings. I'm not going to go through it line by line, but if you look at social welfare, this is the actual percentage. So they talk about where a lot of social expenditure is going. It's targeted towards this group, and it's the same people, generally speaking. And can we target the group? The answer is yes. Even at an early age, predictors found at 3 and 5 are very effective in at least finding which children are sort of at risk. So it's not that you can perfectly predict people or target them like genetic, some kind of disease, like Huntington, there are certain diseases that there is a genetic profile and you could really target it or try to avoid it from early on. But here we have enough information, I think, that looking at early measures of intelligence, self-control, SES, maltreatment, can really suggest which children are at risk. So a targeting strategy can be an effective strategy. So maybe it's inefficient, and I will argue that it is inefficient, to wait for many of these problems to occur. Just to give you an example, if you look, for example, at how you can prevent crime, obviously one way is to hire police. But another is to get children to graduate from high school. And one way to do that is to promote their education. And so literally, if you actually do a cost-benefit ratio for reducing the same amount of crime, and you ask how much does it cost to do it by hiring more police versus by by getting kids to finish high school and participate more actively in school, you get a ratio of somewhere like 5 to 10 to 1 in cost efficiency. So these are statistics that I think should be taken into account in social policy. So anyway, the point is targeting is quite important. And here I would argue that our view of human nature has changed a great deal since Adam Smith wrote. I'm a Chicago economist. I'm supposed to praise Adam Smith at every margin. But in this issue, Smith was very optimistic. He thought that experience was what changed us, that at age 8, we were all equal, that the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker were all essentially equal, and then they just specialized in life and acquired skill. No, from the many, many studies, we find that children are really starting out, at least by ages 3, 4, and 5, very unequal. So we have to act on that. So what I want to try to talk about is how we can actually talk about skill development. So let me just talk briefly about this measure of multiple skills. I already gave you the main punchline. But now this is an active area where economists working together with personality psychologists and others, behavioral economists working with economists, to neoclassical economists to look at this, we're finding the importance of socio-emotional skills, something that used to be just off the table, was viewed as soft and fuzzy. Things like motivation, sociability, attention. Recently, Angela Duckworth has written a trade book called Grit, but it's basically conscientiousness, and it's basically shown to be effective. She has some studies of West Point graduates, lots of other studies showing conscientiousness matters. So these skills, and I would call them skills because they can be shaped. They're not just genetically determined. Almost all of these so-called skills can be genetically determined. So there was a graph earlier today showing education producing skills. I would say that's part of the story, but the skills are also producing the education. And the production of skills is what we really should be about. So I want to argue we should go beyond PISA scores. And here I will just cite a report by the OECD. And they're actively encouraging how we can foster and measure skills. I won't go through it all, but there is a report you can download from the OECD. This is on the website showing the importance. So many, many papers done by these, a whole report by the OECD. But we know, and now this is sort of taking Herrnstein and Murray literally, but instead of just looking at cognitive skills, looking at things like these social and emotional skills, seeing how predictive they are of crime, earnings, health and healthy behaviors, civic participation, trust, and human agency. So across a vector of outcomes, what we see is these skills play a very important role. And I will just, I don't have time to play the game that I'd like to play. In fact, let me take this slide off. Let me ask Dalton a question. I'll ask somebody else. He's too informed. Let me ask you, okay? You, just you. What percentage of the variance in lifetime income is explained by IQ? Straight IQ, Raven's IQ.
In Israel?
Yeah. Many people would say 50. Any other guesses? 50%? You saw my graph. Very small.
You told me yesterday.
I told you, I know. Some of you, I ruined my story. But what I will argue is that these measures of social and emotional traits are as predictive. And there's a whole other story, which is, I would even argue the measure of cognition you used today earlier, AFQT, is kind of an amalgam. It's not just IQ. We think of Raven's IQ as an abstract intelligence. It's also a measure of social and emotional skills because it's an achievement test. And achievement tests capture not only raw ability, but how serious you are, how open you are to experience. So we have to be a little careful about those cognitive components. But nonetheless, these skill gaps, these skills, nonetheless, I think soft skills play a major role. And I'll show you, if I have time, to actually talk about how important they really are in understanding effective policy and evaluation of policy. So this is a graph that I've used many times. It's actually due to, there are multiple sources here, Brodsky, Brooks, Gunn. This is a graph that's been replicated, or versions of it, around the world, not just in the US. I think there's a version here in Israel. I know there is in Hong Kong, in Colombia, in India. What does it show? It's looking at achievement scores. This is like an AFQT now. But it's looking at age 18, the gap between the achievement scores of kids whose mothers are high school graduates. And then the bottom graph at 18 is the achievement score. This is on a standardized, age-adjusted scale of dropouts. And what you'll notice is these are American data, by the way, where the schools are very unequal. You'll notice that the gap there at 18 is actually there at 5. It's almost there at age 3. Before age 3, it's very difficult to measure IQ, so we don't really know. And there are versions of this. And here's where I get to Denmark. Here's Denmark. Very equal, I can promise you. You look up the OECD statistics, you look at its own report. Look at the gap in Denmark. This is now, these are modern cohorts, and we have data over the whole lifetime of individuals. Look at the gap. I mean, my Danish isn't so good, but it's the same order. High educated mothers to less educated mothers. And so if we look at age 0, at birth weights, we're getting a gap by the education of the mother. Now, this is with universal health care, not much discrimination. And what you see is these gaps. What's that? You disagree? Okay, it is fascinating. I think it is. So give me another couple of hours so I can finish. No, but what you see, so you see this thing about neonatal wards and so forth, but now look at 3 to 5, measures of self-regulation. If you now look at 8 to 14, this is in terms of test scores now, the kind of achievement test scores, those gaps are there as well. If you look, for example, in years of schooling, same gaps. Keep going out to age 40, wage earnings, then health, in the labor force, still alive. So by measures of life, early childhood environments are playing a role. And in Denmark, I want you to keep that in mind. We'll get back to that. So the question is, how do we interpret it? And so we've already heard about genes. I would just argue, I would embellish one of your graphs by this famous graph, you've seen it probably many times, about how the expression of the gene itself is modified by environment. These are just SNPs, right, of identical twins. And the only thing you need to know is the coloration is measuring how genes are expressed. Those are 3-year-old twins on the left-hand side, 50-year-old twins on the right-hand side. And you can see that the differential coloration is showing gene expression on monozygotic twins that have exactly the same DNA. So experience really does get under the skin and even modifies how DNA is expressing itself. But I don't think that's well enough known to worry about these epigenetic phenomena. It's known that there is a phenomenon. How important it is empirically, I don't think we know yet in terms of explaining. But it does suggest how the environmental effect on gene expression can be very important. So we also know, we have a lot of evidence, we have a lot of evidence that, and this is work done, again, 20 years ago. I'm just reviewing a lot of the early studies. If you look at kids' environments, and this is a study done by Hart and Risley 20 years ago, and you look at the nature of environments, what's going on in the family for less educated mothers, or, you know, welfare mothers in this case versus professional mothers, you're finding by the time in a typical hour, the welfare kid, the kid whose parents are on welfare, disadvantaged child, is hearing about 600 words. The professional kid is hearing more than 2,000. And if you look at exactly what the vocabulary would be at age 3, the kids from professional families are getting more than twice as many words. That's starting at age 3. And it's not just the number of words heard, it's also the nature of the parenting environment, how supportive, how negative it is. So that's another important finding, and that's been replicated. This study by Fernald, who was at Stanford, replicates the Hart and Risley study. This is the best I could find in Israel. There are something comparable graphs in the Israeli data. So there really are these gaps, and we ask, why are these gaps? Where do they arise from? You talked about genes. Think of this much more than genes going on. As you said, much more than genes. So this is a graph also that's gone around the world. If you look at the US and you look at what family environments are as measured by per capita expenditures on children, you see substantial differences. Starting in cohorts in 72 up to 2005, 2006, the gap in expenditure between the top quintile and the bottom quintile has grown. So there's certainly some growth at the bottom, but spectacular growth at the top. Probably more perception because of all the work on child development, recognition of how important the early years are. And again, we can look at studies here, the average math scores. You get a similar gradients in Israel. I'll skip over that. But home environments are compromised. Question? No, okay, somebody was grumbling, going too fast. So there is a worldwide trend, and I think this differs between the US and Israel. In the US, we have a serious issue about home environments. I think it's less of a problem here. In the US, we have now a big growth in the percentage of children under 18 living in single-parent families, and single-parent families where there's never been a parent around. And in the US anyway, these are children of disadvantage. These are less educated women. They're living without a lot of support. And some of these cohabiting partners would be having as many as 11 partners per year in terms of turnover. So very unstable families. And the other sectors, divorce, I mean, there was a growth in divorce. So family environments are there. Less of a problem here in Israel, both for the Arabs and the Jews. And this, I think we saw earlier, the share of births outside marriage, very low in Israel. That's not an issue, so I will not. But I will argue that if you look at studies even in Northern Europe, especially when Americans are compared, the notion of cohabitation versus marriage, it's a controversial subject. Many people in Denmark, for example, would argue that cohabitation is more or less the same as marriage, a stable cohabitation. So recently, a group of people in Denmark with whom I'm working, Dorothy Blazes and Michael Jensen, I guess, kindly gave me this kind of information, where we're looking at the difference between a married couple, a stable cohabiting couple, and basically single mother families. And you can see these gradients are there in things like self-regulation, these soft skills. So even in a very stable welfare state, the notion of, there is something to marriage. And you can look at these graphs. I've got empathy and so forth. So these relationships hold up even when you control for family income and look for mother's education. These are stable relations. And this is, again, taking us back to Dalton. The question is family influence just about money? And that's been a frequent topic. We even measure child poverty by money. I don't think that's the proper measure. And I think the answer is, as Susan Mayer was talking about in a lot of the study, only 5 minutes? Holy smokes. How about 10 minutes? Yeah. I thought I had an hour.
Until 5.
Oh, wait, then I have 15 minutes. Okay, good. I do want to show you some evaluation results. So anyway, yeah. So let me just say that the Great Society had this notion that family income was playing a major role. We didn't know any better in the 1960s. So Lyndon Johnson's premise and that of his social planners was we change poverty, we transfer income, we break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. And that, I think, was a huge program. And it worked in the sense that it did reduce inequality. The Gini coefficient in the US went down dramatically in the 1960s. But if you looked at the cycle of intergenerational poverty, it did not. And that's exactly what led Clinton. So there's a recent paper by Hartley and others, this is from the Poverty Center at the University of Kentucky, showing that, you know, after the Great Society cohorts kicked in, the intergenerational correlation of welfare, if anything, increased. And so the idea of giving money per se, and there were other issues. So we learned, I think, that sort of creating, just giving people money and in some sense stigmatizing them and taking them out of society and making welfare enclaves was a very bad social policy. We learned that. But there are still a lot. The Pope is still pushing for more money and thinking about money as the way to do it. And I think that's a serious issue. So now let me get to some analytics here, which is in my, 30 minutes remaining? Good. No, there are two ideas here that I think are very important. And this is something that shows up. So there hasn't been this much of a life cycle focus in the development. There's one notion out there called the Matthew effect. And at least I don't know if it's used here so much because that's in the New Testament of the Bible. But there is a Matthew. To those who have, more is given. And it is true, by the way, if you look at age 20 and you look at children who benefits the most from going to college? Children who have very high ability and people who have very high social skills, conscientious children. So high returns for more capable people. And so in the old days, this would have been thought to be an argument for why we should subsidize the smart kids and put the dumb ones in the reservations, like Herrnstein was talking about. And it turns out that if we start at age 20 and ask where is the money spent most efficiently, it probably is to the most motivated and the able. But that's not the whole story. And this is, I think, where the whole story has been supplemented. So from the social Darwinist story, that essentially was the Herrnstein Murray story, we've actually moved beyond that. And what we now understand from a lot of work in neuroscience, from a lot of work in psychology, now economists come on board on this, but now we understand that these skills that we used to think were genetically given, like IQ and things like soft and social, these are things that actually can be changed. Young children are much more fluid, they're much more malleable, and what we see is that investments early on, precisely because of this phenomenon of high return later on, can be very productive. This is a little bit of dynamic economics. You build the skill base precisely because the return at older age is so high to those skills, makes the skill base to be able to realize those high returns, makes the return so high for early investment. That is an argument that is now, I would call, dynamic complementarity, and that undoes. And the empirical argument is supporting very high returns to this early environment. But it's basically just doing this. So I would argue that both processes are at work. It's that static complementarity that makes the dynamic complementarity so effective. It makes the early years so effective. You can get very high returns by taking disadvantaged kids who are much more malleable, much more flexible. You know, the old statement, you know, can't teach an old dog new tricks. The older the dog, the harder it is. And so here, you're playing the message. Here's the dynamics. This is a graphical version. But how does it play out? This is this curve that was being referred to earlier. So this is a hypothetical curve. And this equation, or this graph, is really saying what? Suppose we're at the beginning of life. So we're looking at where we put the first unit of value in the life of the child. Where's the very highest return? In the early years, the prenatal years, probably before birth. And why? Because it builds the skill that essentially allows people to take advantage of all the subsequent opportunities in life. Now, this isn't an equilibrium relationship for those economists in the room. This is an out of equilibrium relationship, but it's showing exactly why there is such a high return, because there's high return later in life to these skills. If you have the base, you can realize a lot of opportunities later on. And but the trouble is that if we look at expenditures, as you were saying, 0 to 3, and 0 to 5 actually in most countries, for many reasons, political reasons and so forth, people argue, well, we can't interfere with the family. We need to sort of leave it alone. And I would argue that in many countries around the world, not just the U.S., the family is in real trouble in the sense of, really being challenged in terms of resources, parenting, and the like. So the understanding of dynamics is important. So, I mean, it's a fact, another piece of fact about the early years being important. There are Lundberg studies that have shown that by age 18, 50% of lifetime earnings can be explained by factors in place at 18. So early life years are important. So let me talk about a few interventions if I can, and why. So this isn't all just hot air and I'm talking about drawing graphs. This is based on a lot of empirical studies. So let me just talk about a couple of projects. And this is one, the Perry Preschool Project, that predates, at least in the United States, any other early childhood program. And it's a program on which I'm actively working today. I'm going to report some results that we actually have data on these people now at age 55. They were initially enrolled in this program when they were age 3 in a disadvantaged suburb of Detroit, or a small city outside of Detroit. So the Perry Preschool Project was started at age 3, 2 hours a day. It was a curriculum where kids were brought in, they planned, they reviewed their tasks, okay? So without getting into too many of the details, I will just say that this is a program that was fairly modest. It's really just 2 hours a day, 5 days a week during the school year for 2 years. And then they're put back in the school system, no further intervention taken. Fairly modest intervention. But these kids were randomly assigned, some to treatment, some to control, and they were followed. They were followed now to age 55. I mean, I helped conduct a survey after age 40. I'll show you some of the results. So without getting into the details, but this is the IQ story, what was the motivation in 1960s for these programs? It was to boost IQ. That was the era of cognitive psychology. Everybody believed that IQ was the be-all and end-all of human existence. You had this fade out. And this kind of fade out, which Arthur Jensen also noticed in his famous book or study of Harvard Educational Review, he was saying that these programs could not work. Because look, here we saw treatment. At age 3, they were basically randomized to be the same. By age 5, the treatment group had much higher IQ. By age 10, the treatment and control group had essentially the same IQ. Therefore, it was a failure. Therefore, said Arthur Jensen, Head Start was a failure. But the failure was not the program. The failure was in the measurement and understanding that something besides IQ was really important. So it turns out that when you do a rate of return analysis on the Perry program, you find that the rate of return is something like 7 to 10% per year, per annum. For each dollar invested, 7 to 10% per annum. And what was the channel? Through non-cognitive skills. And ironically, and to stick the barb in you, no, but ironically, even though these kids were no smarter, they effectively had higher AFQT type scores. Why? Because they worked harder at school. So even though they had the same IQ between treatment and control, they were more motivated kids. It's just that motivation and these other things were viewed as soft and fuzzy, and the Ravens IQ test, or the PISA test, was viewed as the ultimate standard for all educational programs. So here I can show you evidence. I'll be happy to send these slides around. We actually were able to construct measures of these academic motivation. And here's what's called the California Achievement Test. It's like the AFQT, and finding the treatment group actually had much higher scores. The whole distributions shifted to the right. And so what happened? These kids. We start looking at these kids. We can start seeing that when you interview them later in life, they felt they belonged to school. So there were a lot of changes. They were less likely to use drugs, guns, knives, and so forth. And so with a lot of measures, you saw activity. But what else happened? It changed the nature of the relationship between the parent and the child. And this is another message I do want to get in I guess I do have only 5 minutes remaining. But what happens in these programs, in fact, all the successful programs, is that the kids come home. They're very motivated. The parents respond to that. There were home visits, but not all these programs have had home visits. But all the successful programs have seen that the parents themselves are doing more parenting. There's more warmth in the environment. Remember that Hart and Risley slide showing how there were differential parenting styles. You change that style. And of course, the parents stay with the kid over the whole childhood, not just the 2 years of the intervention. So that is essentially a powerful mechanism that I would argue is successful. So I won't be able to show you all the graphs, but I will show you something interesting. The Perry kids are now 55. The Perry kids have kids. So we can now look at what the effects are on the kids of the Perry kids. These are new results. We just got this data. So what we can see is across things like completed high school, the health of the child, employed full-time, that red dot is the treatment effect. And below it are the p-values, if you're into that, finding relatively strong effects of, lower arrest rates, suspension rates, and so forth. So what's happening is, there are differences by gender. I won't be able to get into that of the participants' children themselves. But what you find is intergenerational effects. So there's a multiplier effect. And this is something that hasn't been evaluated, and it has yet to be calculated as part of the rate of return. I will just, if I have a minute or two, I'll talk about the Carolina ABC program, and then I'll stop. But I do have a nice story about Denmark, but I guess I won't be able to tell it. But the Carolina ABC program was a program that was done 10 years later, much more intensive. It started earlier. It started at 8 weeks of life. It was 8 hours a day, 5 days a week during the school year for 5 years. So that very intensive. It provided two things: child care for the mothers, and it also provided income so the mothers could work. And then it also provided stimulation for the child. So you had this program, much more intensive, much more costly than Perry. So we evaluated that, and we recently put out we're putting a questionnaire in the field at age 45. We have the data through age 35. So it's a very intensive intervention. A lot of programs have been patterned after this. There are like 20 programs around the world that have the ABC as its basic core ingredient. So what are the effects? You find a lasting effect on IQ if you start earlier. You find huge effects on health. You find positive effect on female behavior and mental health, reduced criminal activity, and on and on. Just show you the health results. What you see is at age 35, just comparing treatment and control, it's localized though for males. If you look at the systolic blood pressure, you see a gap. 143 for the control means 125 for the treatment. Substantial difference. If you look at metabolic syndrome, a precursor predictor of diabetes and later life conditions, you see substantial differences in these conditions. So obesity, most of the indicators are showing substantial health effects. Remember, they started this intervention the same way as Perry did. They wanted to boost IQ. What they did is they intervened with the child, they boosted these soft skills, and they created health effects, which they didn't even look for until age 35. And the reason why, people had more self-control, there was more regulation, they read the health, so they were more engaged in society. So big boost in IQ, you take my word for it, but the statistically significant measures, we're measuring it now at 45. And look at the cost-benefit ratio, very costly program, $20,000, $20,000 a year, or $18,000 a year. So it's close to like $90,000 to 2014 dollars up cost in the first 5 years. Sounds like it's totally prohibitive. But if you look at the benefits, the discounted lifetime benefits followed through the lifetime, projection after age 35, but nonetheless, you find huge total benefits, well over $400,000 a year. That's discounted, present value of earnings. You find what are the components in the labor incomes, and then the parental income. Now, for the good economists in the room, they'll say, wait, maybe if the market's really efficient for childcare, you shouldn't count this, and I'll show you the number without counting it. But there's also the notion that the parents themselves are allowed to go to work. They're allowed to actually finish school, and so there are effects. So it depends on how you model the childcare market. Big effects on crime and big effect on the quality of life, which is a health measure. And now, when you factor in the health costs, you're finding rates of return about 13.7% per annum. Bigger effects on health for men than for women, but these are substantial effects. And these count the tax costs of raising the funds to support it. So there's a welfare cost of taxation. So this is the sensitivity analysis I'm referring to. This shows you what the rates of return are and the benefit cost ratios when you delete any one of those components, any two of the components, and so forth. Don't have time to go through it, but you can look at it. And again, the same mechanism, that what you find is the kids are more motivated. I won't be able to make this methodological lesson, but what you find is, and one of the benefits is parent-child enhancement, the engagement. It's been one of the benefits of every successful intervention that I've seen. So there are other programs, and the trouble with these programs has been that these programs do many things. So they're not isolating what is it that makes Perry or ABC effective. You know, you're doing lots of things to these kids, even 2 hours a day. Fortunately, there are some studies with randomized controlled trials and long-term follow-up which allow us to isolate the component. And I would argue, and this is me going out on a limb, but I think it's a limb that's pretty sturdy, actually, and that is, the Jamaican study was a study done in the slums of Jamaica. It was done initially for disadvantaged, stunted kids. And they had multiple arms, where they were giving the kids nutrition, they were giving the kids only stimulation, and it was done at 18 to 34 months of age. And what you found is when you looked at these kids 20 years later, in their mid-20s, you found very substantial improvements in their education and in their reduction in crime, their earnings, and so forth. So very strong, and I think it was really just isolating it to one component, which was parental engagement with the child. This has been replicated recently in Ireland, Preparing for Life. Similar program, very low key. None of these costly programs. I mentioned, what was Jamaica? 18 to 34 months, relatively unskilled teachers going to the homes a couple of weeks, couple of hours every 2 weeks. That's it. Not intensive, not 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And what you found was very substantial effects. Here in Ireland, you got something very similar. Basically, you're finding very strong components, very strong returns, just over these dimensions, cognitive, language development. We don't have long-term follow-up. It is a randomized controlled trial. And what happens is very, very substantial benefits. And how expensive? It's basically 51 hours over 5 years of the life of the child with these measures. Much cheaper. So I would argue, again, this is going out on a limb. It's just one piece of what these other programs were. But in each case, it was teaching parents, engaging parental-child engagement. I would argue that's the key. So I have to stop. I'm sorry. I really am sorry. But I will, let me just conclude, because you wanted me to talk about other interventions. University of Chicago has run something called the Charter School Program. There's a new book out by Raudenbush and his co-authors. I work with Raudenbush. He's a sociologist at Chicago, demographer, statistician. But the whole Chicago School Consortium, of which I'm only a bystander, has been trying for 25 years, Tony Bright, experimenting with how to make successful schools now, not preschools. How can you get it? So they actually ended up, after 25 years of experimentation, by founding a chartered school, 2 of them actually. And what did they do? What were the successful ingredients? It turns out that these kids have been followed now at least into the late years of the elementary school. They started the kids at age 4. So it's almost like Perry age, preschool, not early in life. But what was the key? The key was mentoring. It's this kind, whether it's parenting or whether it's surrogate parenting, which I would argue that's what mentoring is. But what you find is essentially very enriched charter schools. And you're finding they have a randomized controlled trial, and what they're finding is that these parenting type interventions, staying with the kid, mentoring, it's costly though. The later it is, you're taking the kid, you're saying, I have these goals. If the kid falls behind, there's a mentor. Somebody is in their lives, and you see a strong effect. And so, you know, going over the other, so the very strong effects, you can read the book. It's called The Ambitious Elementary School, just published by the University of Chicago Press. And coming back to the job training programs I started at the beginning, the fact of the matter is that these adolescent training programs, some of them are effective. But which ones are the effective ones? Again, the ones that attach mentoring, that essentially provide some guidance. So just teaching the kids to repair an obsolete Volkswagen engine and, in a large impersonal training center doesn't do the job. Giving them mentoring and life skills turns out to be important, and there are a lot of interventions that I can talk about. So let me just conclude. I think that the ingredient that I found is mentoring or age-adjusted parenting. I think, so I'll skip this as another intervention in high school. The universal ingredient, I think, is something parenting, mentoring, and love. So I actually had an interview on NPR and love, and they started playing the Beatles song, All It Takes Is Love. There's kind of a version of that here, that all it takes in some sense is somebody staying with the kid, giving some advice. Doesn't have to be that intensive, but engaging the kid. So I'm not going to talk about geography as destiny, and I will just say that, no, I won't. I mean, there's a whole other discussion, and I won't be able to do it. But can I talk about Denmark?
Yeah, okay, so
Wait, just Denmark.
So let's open the questions. My question is, tell me about Denmark.
Okay, I'll tell you about Denmark. Oh, no, I'll tell you about Denmark. No, the reason why Denmark, to me, is so interesting is it came up in the presidential campaign. Hillary Clinton talked about it. Everybody sees Denmark. People go to Denmark to see how we should devise a welfare state for the U.S. So it's certainly true that Denmark is very, very generous. And it actually produces much better test score distributions for the children. No question about that either. You look at the mathematics and readings, no question about it. But nonetheless, I already showed you those gradients early on. Very substantial gradients. So what's going on? This is just a repeat of what I showed you earlier. The IGE in terms of income, it's very much lower, the beta. So there's much less transmission. Why? Because of the tax and transfer system. Denmark has very generous taxes, generous, I shouldn't use the word generous transfers and very high tax rates. But if you look at the educational mobility, how much the education of the child is related to the education of the parent, it's on league with the United States. So the Gatsby curve for education is kind of similar between Denmark and the US. And there's strong sorting on family background. So here it is, you have near equalization. The schools are all the same. That's the amazing thing. And yet, the family is sitting there, lurking in the background, the missing ingredient. And it's harder than we think. It's not just a matter of spending more on preschools. It's really trying to get directly into it. And then there's another whole story. Part of the reason, too, for education, and we have some evidence on it, is that the tax and transfer policy actually discourages acquiring skills. So if you have too high a tax rate, you may be better suited to get education, but the reward to doing so is low. So I'll stop now. So I think this is what we find.
So your Danish data showed that already at birth, in terms of low birth weight, which research by myself, by Doug Allman, by Sandra Black has shown is really predictive of labor market success. There's already this socioeconomic disparity at birth.
Right.
Your investment returns chart showed that prenatal was actually better than early childhood. What policies do we have to improve birth outcomes?
Well, I think one thing we've learned, and I think it's very interesting, of course there are a lot of other programs that I didn't talk about, partly because the proprietors of those programs won't release their data. That's another story. But I think we know that information to the mother and providing kind of a rich environment, even when the kid is conceived, can play a huge role. So what I mean is screening the child, finding out, teaching the mother not to drink and smoke when she's carrying the child. In some of the Indian or indigenous reservations in Canada, fetal alcohol syndrome is a huge problem, and it just marks the child over its life. So you tell the mother, you advise the mother that these kinds of insults have lifetime consequences, and there is movement in that direction. So I think providing the information, you can't talk down to people. You just got to give them the information. Screening, health screenings, and then providing the mother information early, I think could be a major role. So I do think the healthcare system could be supplemented. The IHDP, I'm sorry, the ABC and the IHDP I didn't talk about, but it's cloned off of the ABC, did have early health screenings for the kids. Not prenatal, though, not prenatal. So So I would argue that I think we want to start earlier, and as you said, you know, the birth weights are really pretty substantially different. And again, they have universal health care. And, you know, you can get rid of the immigrants. So if you take the Turks, it's primarily Turks in these studies, these long-term studies. You take the Turks out of the data, you're still finding those gradients are there, even among the so-called native Danes. So I think there really is information, and there really is something about family influence, and it really is there even in relatively intact families.
Let's take one more. Okay, go ahead.
No, many more.
Oh, many more. Go ahead, ask.
Sorry.
Yes. Okay. So,
Sorry,
thank you
I get
very
carried
much.
away.
Yes. Thank you very much for your here. Thank you very much. I'm sure that I will say it again in slow motion and understand. But maybe I missed it. But the correlation between the immobility and the inequality before.
Which ability? I'm sorry.
The immobility and
Immobility.
the inequality
right.
before taxes and the transfer, the market inequality is higher compared to the...
Weaker. I mean, that curve, because remember that pre-tax and transfer, what you found is the inequality was more equal. I mean, there are common market forces operating in Europe. And so the pre-tax and transfer is largely determined by the price of skills. And actually pre-tax, and it's not identical. I can't find the slide now, but if you look at it, you can see pre-tax and transfer. So it's much flatter, that curve. It's after tax and transfer. So I'm saying
but the
the Danish
correlation.
miracle is a tax transfer miracle, not an educational investment miracle. And that, frankly, I was deeply surprised by that. I'm still not quite sure I believe it, but we've had this now for 2 years, and we've tested it, and we're doing further work and comparing. So
Right.
there's what? You understand that it's a common, I mean, it's skills that are driving it, pre-tax and transfer.
But the correlation, not the
Yeah, but
correlation
the
to
correlation
immobility.
is like the regression coefficient. It would be flatter.
Go ahead.
See, it's flatter because, right? Because, I mean, the whole curve, the whole level, the variation among countries in terms of the pre-tax transfer inequality is much less. So that's just going to give you a weaker correlation or weaker regression coefficient.
Next question. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have. Excuse me? Yeah, so
Oh.
over here. So I have one small comment and then one question. And the comment is that both lectures that we heard today in English are very pessimistic because once people adjust, they will do genetic screening, and once the information is out there, what we know about human nature is that the rich will even invest more in early childhood, and then therefore the gap is probably going to grow, if anything. But what I wanted to ask you more specific.
It depends on how we invest.
No, okay, so now I want to go to how we invest.
Okay, yeah.
So the question is this. The fact is that investing in good parenting is a public good, as you seem to suggest, because the rate of return for credit-constrained families is going to be very, very high. We also know that this is a private good, and we could expect a lot of the families to invest in it anyway. And what I wanted to know is, where do you think is the kind of the edge of public investment? Where do you think the payoff starts to go down, either because parents invest in themselves, or because they invest enough in order? So just in terms of percentage of the population, if we're thinking about intervention, what is the percentage of society that we're looking at that will need this kind of intensive intervention that will lead into high returns?
Well, a couple of aspects to your question, but first of all, I'll draw on the Gatsby-Moffat, the 20%, 80%. That's a rough cut on the data. And we can target those kids. So we see disadvantaged kids. There's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Indicator developed about childhood. So we can monitor and measure what our early childhood environments are like. The Canadians have this measure, what is called the Early Childhood Development Indicator, which can help in screening. So I think we can target effectively the children, and I think targeting is important. There are a lot of political imperatives that say you shouldn't target. If you go to New York City, de Blasio wants universal. It's crazy. The reason why it's crazy is that the kids from the affluent environments are getting much better than what they'll ever get from these preschool programs that are publicly provided, unless we put the bar very, very high, and it's usually not high. In fact, there's some evidence that can even harm compared to what they would have had otherwise. But you ask about public versus private good. Crime is not exactly a private good. So the fact that you're finding people who are more likely to commit crime, I'm talking about the real resource. I'm not talking about transfers. What I'm talking about, the cost of crime, is the real physical harm, the incarceration costs, the damage, lost lives, and so forth. Those are real costs, and that has a huge public good aspect. And depending, again, how healthcare is financed, that also has some aspect, at least sharing the burden. So a lot of these private decisions have public consequences, and I think that we should really understand that people just don't want to get near the early childhood because they view it as, you know, tampering with the family. But the fact of the matter is, the family is the fountain of success and also of failure, and I think that's something that public policy has to recognize.
Well, I'm afraid that we're going to have to cut this off. I know a lot of people want to ask questions, but we have another panel that was supposed to start already, so we're going to go straight into the next panel. And thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.